Chapter 6. The Self and its Affiliations, continued. Having in the last paper considered the self and its affiliations from the within point of view, we may now with advantage study the same subject on its more external side. A certain school of psychologists, in trying to explain the total consciousness of an organism as the sum, in some sense, of the consciousnesses of its separate cells, are met with serious criticism, and themselves find a difficulty in the question of how the separate cell consciousnesses can possibly be fused in one consciousness, or how even we can conceive such a thing. How can one cell know, it is said, what its neighbor feels, or fuse its neighbor's experience with its own? What kind of total ego is it that can possibly gather up the experiences of millions of lesser egos and render them one? And the difficulty is perfectly natural, and indeed insuperable, as long as the egos of the cells are held to be distinct and separate. But as soon as we see that, as suggested in the last chapter, that they may be the same, that they may be already one, the difficulty disappears. We have indeed arrived at the conclusion that all egos are finally the same, though differing little or much in aspect, in affiliation, in ramification, even as every twig on a tree dates back to the trunk and has a common life with the others, however different from them in aspect to the outer world, or in affiliation to its main stem it may be. And so it is not difficult to conceive of them as fusing their knowledge. Indeed, it is inevitable that they should do so. Let us consider for a moment the genesis of the body, human or other. The body grows from one cell, sperm, and germ united. The cell obtains nourishment from the organism of the mother in the higher creatures, and grows and splits into 2, 4, many, and then multitudes of cells, which dispose themselves into certain forms, the outlines of the growing creature. At the same time, the dividing and multiplying cells become differentiated from each other, and finally, in the human being, break up into some 30 well-marked varieties, according to their uses and functions in the complete organism. To make the meaning of this process clear, we must remember that we were compelled to think of the ego of that primitive cell as itself a unitary but enormously complex being, manifested at first in the lowest degree. Then we see the multiplication and differentiation of that cell simply as the process by which the various complexities of its inner being are further manifested, their manifestations, no doubt, being sundered in the world of space, but their inner nature losing nothing of its original unity. To proceed, the growing, multiplying, differentiating cells are all in touch and in relation with each other, but in time, by special nerve channels, themselves composed of cells, more special and closer relations are established. Groups are formed, which tend to act and to feel together. And again, in time, some of these groups unite and form larger groups, and so on up to the whole organism. As to the nerve channels, which represent at any rate the subtler and swifter and more specialized relations, though not by any means all the relations, they are of various kinds and structure, and are minutely distributed over the whole body. And the nerve centers and plexuses, which bring these relations to definite focus in a vast variety of ways, are also widely distributed, not only in the brain and an encephalon, but all down the spinal cord and in the trunk of the body, where they lie embedded among the organs. Such is the process of the growth of the body, and such, as we have seen, or very similar, is the growth of the mind. In fact, in the case of the latter, using the word thought to cover all affections of the mind, we have seen that a very primitive or elementary thought must first appear. That this being fed and added to by the happenings of the outer world repeats itself and multiplies, and becomes differentiated into other nearly resembling thoughts, and that by degrees the ego groups these elementary thoughts into more inclusive thoughts, as when it groups a number of separate pulses into a musical sound, and then these group thoughts again into higher group thoughts, as when it groups musical sounds into melodies or harmonies. And as in this mental process we are compelled to think of the same ego, which underlies the total mind, or one of the higher group thoughts, as underlying also the more elementary thoughts, the same I that perceives the melody perceiving also the separate notes. So we may seem justified in supposing, in the case of the bodily cells, that their myriad egos form what may be called a group soul, that they are in fact one and the same with the soul of the whole body. The difference is, of course, that in the simple cell, though the total ego is there, it is necessarily expressed only to a very simple and primitive degree, whereas in the groups of cells, especially when the latter have reached some degree of differentiation, it may be much more fully expressed. We can hardly refuse to think that not only complexity, but volume of feeling depends to some extent on the largeness of the group of cells concerned. Thus, in the great emotions, fear, anger, etc., it is obvious that vast multitudes of cells are agitated, whole organs affected, secretions changed, and so forth. But in pure thought or representation, where no emotion is concerned, as for instance in simply using the word fear, there is no sense of volume, and probably quite a few little cells in the brain, specially differentiated to express that simple concept, are all that is required. There is no feeling, probably, which carries with it more permanent volume, as well as a great degree of complexity, than that of selfness, and we may associate that with the supposition that, roughly speaking, all the cells of the body, though their instinct and self-preservation, if through nothing more complex, are concerned in it. I think myself, subject of course to correction, that it is a mistake to suppose that consciousness is limited to the cells in a certain portion of the brain. The hypothesis does at best sound very improbable. Certainly it is likely that the cells of the cortex are specialized in that direction, and particularly as representatives of the second stage of consciousness. But this would not imply that other cells, from which the cerebral cells have been differentiated, have not the same faculty, but in less degree. To even the simplest tissue cell one must credit sensibility, to the nerve cells higher sensibility, to others perhaps, as those of the sympathetic system, simple consciousness, to the brain cells or groups of self-consciousness, and there must be many cells or groups which represent those higher orders of consciousness, of which we are occasionally aware. That there is a diffused consciousness all through the body, I think anyone who attends to the subject will feel persuaded, and that, in some sense, independent of the brain. It is, in fact, the primitive consciousness out of which the more complex brain consciousness has been evolved, and it links on to that subliminal region of the mind, of which we have heard so much lately, the vast, quote, fringe of thought and feeling which surrounds our ordinary consciousness, which never comes quite into the full light of observation, and yet is always obscurely present. In these lights it does not seem difficult to think of the egos of the body cells as one with the total ego, which represents the fusion of their separate consciousnesses, one with it, though each less adequately manifested than the whole. And indeed I believe they love to feel this affiliation. Dimly they are conscious of it, and it vitalizes them, presiding over and directing their activities. Now here we have to pause, for indeed if my conscious ego and the egos of all my body cells were in the condition of harmony suggested, all would be pancakes and cream. The state of affairs indicated in the former chapter, the art of creation, would be realized. These bodies of ours, and the bodies of other creatures, trees, plants, etc., would be the adequate manifestations, so far, of their respective egos, and would be the forms under which we should apprehend the expression of our own and other minds. Yet clearly this is not so. I and my cells fall out to some extent. They do not always do or say what I want. There are confusions, as well as fusions, alterations, and alternations of personality. My body is not altogether an embodiment of my mind, at any rate of that mind of which I am preponderantly conscious. What is the cause of this discrepancy, or of these discrepancies? This leads us on to further considerations. Exactly as a human body is a complex of cells descended and differentiated from a single pair, so is a human race a complex of bodies, which for our present purpose we may suppose has descended and differentiated from a single pair. I am not alluding to Adam and Eve especially as progenitors of the whole human race, but rather, in order to gain clearness, to smaller tribes and peoples, such as the Maoris, or the Apache Indians, or the old Israelites, much interrelated and in many cases descended from a very few progenitors, if not actually, as their traditions often relate, a single pair. Such a race has all the characteristics of an organic being. It has its well-marked customs, instincts, religion, ideals, external habits of life, grade of mental development, and so forth. It has its individual members, its groups and larger groups, culminating in the whole tribe or race as an entity, just the same as the cells with regard to the human body. And it has its phases of emotion and belief and action, its patriotisms, religions, and warlike and other enthusiasms, belonging to it only as a whole, and called forth somehow by the sentiment of the whole. Crowds are sometimes accessible to a very lofty morality, says a French writer, a much loftier one indeed than that of which the isolated individual is capable. And anyhow we see that societies, not only of bees, as Maeterlinck has shown, but of all creatures up to man, have qua-societies, a life of their own inclusive of, and superadded to, that of their individual members. It is difficult, therefore, in view of all this, to refuse to credit an ego and a consciousness to a well-marked race or people or tribe. And of course this has often been done. While the cognate idea of the, quote, social organism has become a thing of common acceptance. Now if this ascription of an organic and conscious life to huge collections of human beings were merely an abstract affair, like Auguste Comte's humanity, or the Spencerian social organism, it would be, to say the least, a trifle dull and uninteresting. But the moment we realize that it means just the opposite, something very much alive indeed, and entangled in the very heart of our own natures, then it becomes absorbingly important. Not only do we recognize, when these huge crowd emotions come along, that immense unsuspected forces are working within us, but we see that at all times, in some mysterious way, the capacity of entering into the race consciousness is in us, and that daily and hourly this fact is molding and modifying our lives. Just the same as in every limb of my body, there lurks the capacity of being thrilled by the great emotions of my total ego. And this fact in its turn guides and molds the destinies and activities of my tiniest cells. To the more detailed consideration of this subject, and of the way in which the gods, the devils, and the great emotions represent our past in the race consciousness, I have given the next 4 chapters, so I will not dwell upon it here. We may here consider more in detail the mode of arrival of the individual ego on the scene, and his relation to the race life. How did I arrive as regards the race to which I belong? Why, the same protozoic cells, same in fundamental nature or ego, and same by sheer continuity of life, which were in Adam and Eve, have also produced me. Or to bring the matter within more definite compass, the same cells from which Abraham and his wife Sarah sprung, produced also Solomon and St. Paul. I select the Jews as an illustration, because they afford an instance of a very well-defined race, which, notwithstanding occasional lapses, kept itself very pure and unmixed, and as a consequence had the strictest customs and religious ideals, and the strongest national consciousness. That is to say, to put the matter more definitely still, the sex cells of Abraham and Sarah united to form a single cell, from which Isaac sprang. Every cell in Isaac's body was therefore a prolongation and fission growth from that single cell. Isaac in his turn uniting with Rebekah, his cousin, similarly produced Jacob, who again uniting with Leah, his cousin, produced Reuben, Simeon, and Judah, and so on. After endless ramifications in this tree of life, Solomon appeared, and again after more, St. Paul or Jesus. The conclusion is clear. Remembering the immortality of the cells and their continuity of life, with of course great differentiations and ramifications all down the centuries, we see that a tiny group of cells in Abraham's time, themselves related to each other, and probably differentiations of some one cell further back, lay beneath the whole development of the Jewish race through the centuries, and that this latter indeed might reasonably be looked upon as the exfoliation of a single ego, which through this long chain, in hundreds of thousands of lives affiliated to it, sought expression, and so far succeeded in finding it. Well might Jesus of Nazareth exclaim, "Before Abraham was, I am." His consciousness, the consciousness of his own being, had reached that depth at which it had become united with the consciousness of the race, and in using those words he merely stated a fact which he felt within himself and knew to be true. In this view we see and understand the enormous import and sacredness of sex, and its deep association with the religious and communal life of the race, a thing which the earlier and less mixed races understood instinctively, and appreciated much better than we do, but which, for reasons which may later appear, has been to a great degree lost in the modern societies and nations. The sex cells, conserved and perpetuated by each organism, and passed on with fervent care from generation to generation, are the most central and potent and least differentiated of all the cells of the body, the other cells losing their reproductiveness in proportion as they are more and more differentiated. They are the most representative of the body and all its faculties, and within them lies the secret and heart of the race. The same ever-descendant cells, I say, which produce the first man of a race, produce the last man. But the last man is not therefore the same as the first man. The first man may be merely a living soul or psyche. The last may be a quickening spirit. The little primitive cell may grow and differentiate and grow, till that which was in it attains at last to manhood and deliverance. The descendant cells, by ever-renewed practice, generation after generation, in the expression of the ego within them, may attain more and more facility. The art of building up the body, tentative at first, by repetition becomes easy, and if the potency of the cells continues, which without a crossing of the strain with another race, or branch of the great ego, does not always take place, the race in question may reach a high level of development. Thus when a man today, born of such and such parents, appears, his body in its early stages is rapidly and instinctively built up. These stages summing up and embodying the evolution of the race behind it. His ego is already affiliated to that of the race, and his unfoldment, so far, already prepared. His body, so far, represents a summation of an endless series of mental actions preceding his actual nativity, a ramifying thread of race life, here condensed. All the instincts, all the devices, all the mental and physical adjustments, by which during the centuries the ego obtained expression for its own nature and qualities, amid the outer conditions in which the race existed, are, together with that nature and those qualities, summed up and represented in his corporal organism. And within it the immense heritage of race memory is stored. The I, the ego, of his race, is not only present, manifesting itself in time and history, but an aspect, an affiliation of it is now, today, present and existent in that man, in his body. And this brings us back to that discord or discrepancy between the body and the conscious self, which started the subject of the last few pages. Is there reason for supposing a real discord between the ego of the race and the self-conscious individual who is affiliated with it? And is there in the body of the individual man really in some sense a seat of race consciousness, separate from his brain, or that part of it which is the seat of his ordinary mind? To take the last question first, we have already suggested that there is a consciousness belonging peculiarly to the body and its automatic nerve centers and ganglia, with all their instincts, habits, and organic functioning. Though these, partly from our inattention to them, appear as a rule dark and silent, and beyond the region of our voluntary observation or control, yet it is becoming more and more admitted that there is a sort of, quote, awareness of them. Science is less and less able to proceed without the conception of the subliminal mind, or the subjective, or the subconscious, or the fringe, which surrounds the ordinary consciousness. It is more and more seen that the emotions are forms of consciousness, accompanying the organic functions and secretions, and that all the processes of the body contribute their flow, great or small, to the life of the feelings, which again expresses itself in the life of the intellect. There are facts such as second sight, telepathy, and luminous sleep, which indicate states of consciousness existing when the ordinary brain is at rest. There are the facts of cosmic consciousness already alluded to, and lastly, there is a whole series of facts with which I shall deal in the next chapters, which seem to show that there is such a thing as a race consciousness associated with our bodily organization and accessible on occasions to our conscious minds. I do not doubt that the body and its organization are the scene and the seat of an extensive consciousness, of other orders of consciousness, which, though usually hidden from or unrecognized by us, are still really operating within and around our minds, and are directly accessible to them. But whatever consciousness may have its seat in the body, or the cerebellum, or the automatic portions of the brain, and however vast the summation and expression of experience and instinct these may represent, they still do not represent the total possible expression of the ego within. The body, at any rate in childhood, represents only the expression to which the race has attained so far. There are vast deeps of the unexpressed yet behind it, and a progressive power is needed to seek and search and devise and effect ever new advances of expression, however slight. This power is the conscious brain. It is the function of the brain to be continually making new combinations, in which the whole feeling nature can find satisfactions. In other words, to be continually extending the area of expression of that nature. Ever new thoughts, ever new adjustments, ever new combinations. It consciously forms which, as they are finally accepted and grow habitual, fall back into the so-called unconscious mind of the organism, and are replaced by new purposive endeavors. The conscious mind is the pioneer of progress. If we take it as represented by the brain, and if we take the subconscious hereditary mind to be in the main represented by the great sympathetic nerve system, then the discord or discrepancy to which we have alluded is that between the conscious and the subconscious minds, between the brain and the great sympathetic. The discord is, to a certain extent, the progress, and therefore we need not look upon it as bad. It is easy to imagine, and common to observe, that a considerable and rapid mental advance may bring us into conflict with our hereditary thought and habits. Nevertheless, such conflict is uncomfortable and must not be allowed to continue long, at risk of mental or bodily disease. It may indicate either that the hereditary attitude has to be modified, or possibly, on the other hand, that a mental position has been rashly taken up, which may have to be abandoned or altered. The brain may be at fault, or, on the other hand, the great sympathetic may be. Diseases are not unfrequently the clearing and expiation of this conflict, and in that sense they too are not always to be regretted, nor necessarily to be looked on as retrogressions. But this subject, which is a large one, cannot be fully considered here. The conscious mind we may then regard as the latest outgrowth and expression of the unfolding ego, and in that sense it is very important. But to expect our bodies at every moment to transform themselves into expressions of its passing moods would be an absurd thing to do. It is only the advance guard, as it were, of a moving column, the bud on the branch, the crest on the wave. And it is easy to see that without the other, without the subconscious mind and the life of the body, without the great race mind behind it, and those other orders of consciousness to which it is affiliated, it is but a very poor thing, and of comparatively little scope and value. It is perhaps the fault of the modern brain or conscious mind that it has not perceived this. From the moment when the sense of self as a separate being evolved within primitive man and entered into distinct consciousness, from that moment an immense stimulus was given to the brain or the conscious mind to devise satisfactions and expressions for the individual self as apart from the race, and the enormous development of brain power and thought, all in the second stage of consciousness, during the period of civilization goes with this fact, on which indeed we may congratulate ourselves. But it has led to a fearful, and for the first time being, most sinister, divorce between the two parts of man's nature. Amid the clatter of self-interests and self-conscious brain activities, the presence and the functioning of other orders of mind within us have been discounted and disregarded, and cut off from the mass and communal life around him, from the race life behind, and the heaven life within. The little self-conscious man has become a puny creature indeed. We must in the future look to a restoration of the harmony between, roughly speaking, the mind and the body, the brain and the great sympathetic, the conscious and the subconscious man. Why, asked Mr. W. H. Hudson in his last nature story, why does the brightness of the mind so often dim that beautiful physical brightness which the wild animals have? The recovery of the organic consciousness, the realization of the transparency of the body and the splendor of its intuitions, is not an impossible feat. The Hindus and other Orientals have in these directions, partly by deliberate practice, come into touch with and command of regions whose existence the Western peoples hardly suspect. In the West, the modern upgrowth of woman and her influence will ere long make possible a humanity which shall harmonize even in each individual the masculine and the feminine elements, and bring back at last the brain and the self-conscious mind into relation with that immense storehouse of age-long knowledge and power which is represented by the physical body in the individual, as it is represented by the communal life and instinct in the mass people. Thus, finally, looking back on what has been said, we see that the whole of creation falls together into expressions of the one endless, boundless, fathomless self, and its myriad affiliations, expressions reached by infinite divisions into, and differentiations, fusions, and concatenations of the primitive elements of consciousness. Cells, plants, lichens, mollusks, fish, quadrupeds, bee and insect swarms, birds, planets, solar systems, races of men and animals, societies, organisms far stretching in time as well as in space, all illustrate this conception. The whole of creation is alive, but we now understand when we look at a man or a bee that we are not looking at a little separate being that is sprung, as it were, full-armed, out of the ground in the course of a few days or years, and whose actions and perceptions are rounded by that scope, but that we are looking at a being who stretches, through affiliation after affiliation, into the far backward and abysm of time, who through endless centuries has been seeking to express itself, nevertheless whose consciousness is here and now in its visible body, as well as in that age-long world life. The ego of the bee, we understand, is not a perishable thing of 6 or 7 weeks' duration, but is, in its essence, one with the spirit of the hive, whence comes the utter readiness of the bee to give its little body for the safety of the hive. The particular hive or colony of bees, again, is affiliated to the whole race of domestic bees, and this again to the further back race of wild bees. And when our little friend comes humming along the southern wall among the early blooms in the February morning, she brings, as we feel, a message not of the moment, but of things aeonian, slumbering deep in our hearts, as well as in hers. This aliveness of all nature, and its derivation from one absolute and eternal self, must be realized, and if at times the multiplexity of egos, as of gnats in the summer sunshine, in myriad procession and endless turmoil, seems appalling and fatiguing, then at other times their fusion and affiliation with each other into larger and grander beings of comparative fewness seems consoling, and even the conclusion of their ultimate oneness may bring a sense of immense majesty and calm, which, if it should be touched with melancholy, would lead us back quite naturally to the multiplexity again. We may envisage the matter as we like, and according to our mood, sufficient that it is a fact which we have to realize, we may say the fact of the universe. Let us return for a moment to the elementary act of knowledge or perception, from which we started 4 chapters back. I came to the gate of a wood, and see before me the massed foliage and congregated stems. It seems a little matter, but within that simple act sleep the immensities. I am an artist, and the light and shade and color attract me, rousing emotions which I do not analyze. The whisper of the leaves and the songs of the birds wake far-back feelings dating from ancestral ages. I am a woodman, and I see the size and quality of the timber, all the adjuncts of woodcraft, the brushing, the peeling, the felling, and the hauling with the horses, rustle around me, and dim visions rise of the log cabins or wattled huts in which my forefathers lived. The mystery in either case, and the wild life of the woods are there, though unseen, and the instincts which led the Britons to seek them for a cover and refuge, or the Druids to hold their worship among them. All these things are present somehow in that act of perception, and so are the far remembrance of fear and primitive terror, the vision of nymphs and wood gods, and things deep down in the life of the animals, and of the trees themselves, or even in the life of the planet. A wonderful aura and halo surrounds that little scene from the gate, and is latent in its every detail. The young moon sails above in the pure sky of evening, and an immense peace, as of some eternal being, descends, folding in silence the soul of the onlooker. The knowledge of our unfathomable life is implicit in every least act of perception, nor does it bar the expression of our most determined individuality. Nay, it needs this for its expression. It stands revealed and manifest in the words and actions of humanity's best-loved children. Quote, "Afar down I see huge first nothing. I know I was even there. I waited unseen and always, and slept through the lethargic mist, and took my time, and took no hurt from the fetid carbon. Long I was hugged close, long and long. Immense have been the preparations for me, faithful and friendly the arms that have helped me. Cycles ferried my cradle, rowing and rowing like cheerful boatmen. For room to me stars kept aside in their own rings." So says Whitman of the past, and we need not doubt his word, and again of the future. It avails not time or place, distance avails not. I am with you, men and women of a generation, or ever so many generations hence. And again, Jesus of Nazareth says, "Lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world."